hand grabbed a fistful of hair and yanked backward. A woman's knees hit concrete. Hard. She tried to scream, but a palm clamped over her mouth before the sound left her throat. Two more figures stepped in from the shadows. One pinned her arms behind her back. The other drove a knee into her ribs. She folded. The hallway was empty. No footsteps. No alarms. Just the sound of a body being dragged across a cold floor. Above them, a security camera hung from the ceiling. Its red light was off. They knew that. They were counting on it. The woman on the ground was 23 years old. Her name was Marissa Cole. She was serving 60 days for a missed court date. What these men did to her in that corridor would eventually bring down an entire prison. So what stopped them? Stay with me on this one. Now, to understand how Marissa Cole ended up face down on that concrete, you need to understand something about how the system works. Not the justice system in the big abstract sense. The actual daily machinery of it. The part where a real person with a real life gets fed into gears that don't care who she is. Marissa was a dental hygienist. She lived in Rivorton, a mid-sized town in the kind of state where nothing makes national news unless someone famous dies there. She had a job she liked, a lease on a one-bedroom apartment, and a 10-year-old Honda with a check engine light that had been on so long she'd stopped noticing it. She had no record, no history of violence, no political affiliations, nothing. She was, by every measure, ordinary. And that's exactly why what happened to her matters. Because in March of that year, Marissa missed a court date. The court date was for an unpaid traffic fine. The fine was $80. She'd forgotten about it. Most people would. But the court didn't forget. They issued a bench warrant. 2 weeks later, a patrol officer pulled her over for a broken taillight, ran her plates, found the warrant, and put her in handcuffs on the side of the road at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. She was booked into the Whitfield County Correctional Facility. 60-day sentence. Whitfield was a medium-security women's prison, and it was not run by the state. It was run by a private company called Stonebridge Corrections. Stonebridge held the operating contract. They staffed the guards. They maintained the building. They handled intake, medical, food service, everything. The state paid them per inmate per day. That's an important detail. Remember it. Because the entire story turns on the difference between how many women were actually inside that building and how many the state was paying for. Marissa didn't know any of this when she arrived. She came in with her head down, answered the intake questions, put on the jumpsuit, and did what every new inmate does. She tried to become invisible. The warden's name was Carl Brecker. He'd run Whitfield for 11 years. He was not a loud man. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He walked the halls once a day, always at the same time, 4:15 in the afternoon, nodded at the guards, and returned to his office. He had the kind of authority that doesn't come from shouting. It comes from the fact that everyone around you knows you can end them. The guards answered to Brecker. The medical staff deferred to Brecker. Even the Stonebridge regional supervisor checked in with Brecker before making staffing changes. If something happened at Whitfield, it happened because Brecker allowed it. Full stop. Marissa was assigned to the laundry detail. 6-hour shifts in a room that was always 10 degrees too hot. Folding linens and sorting jumpsuits that all smelled the same no matter how much detergent you used. She ate in the cafeteria, where the meals rotated on a weekly schedule that never changed. Monday was a chicken patty. Tuesday was some kind of stew. Wednesday was anybody's guess. She learned to eat fast, keep her tray close, and never sit at the tables near the back wall, where the women who had been inside the longest sat and watched everyone else like they were keeping a tally of every weakness in the room. She kept her mouth shut. She didn't make friends. She didn't make enemies. She did the thing that people do when they're counting days. She went small, and she shared a cell with a woman named Diane Harwell. Diane was 46, quiet, sharp-eyed. She spent most of her time writing in a composition notebook with a black cover. Not letters, not a diary, something else. Marissa didn't ask. You don't ask inside. You wait. You watch. And for the first 3 weeks, that's exactly what Marissa did. She folded sheets. She counted the days. 37 left. Then 32. Then 28. And then, on her 33rd day inside, she heard something that put a target on her back. She was in the supply closet off the laundry room, restocking bleach containers on the lower shelf, when 2 voices bled through the thin wall from the office next door. She didn't recognize the first voice. Low, businesslike, clipped sentences. But the second voice she knew. It belonged to Sergeant Dwayne Platt, the senior corrections officer on her block. Platt was the kind of man you don't forget once you've seen him. Big. Not Jim Big. Naturally thick, with a crew cut and hands that looked like they were built for something rougher than clipboard checks. He rarely spoke to the inmates directly. When he did, his voice was flat and unhurried, like a man who had never once been in a rush because he'd never once been afraid of consequences. The conversation lasted maybe 90 seconds. But in those 90 seconds, Marissa heard dollar amounts, contract figures, a name she didn't recognize then but would come to know well, Stonebridge, and one sentence that lodged in her brain like a splinter. Brecker signs off on the count. We bill for the overage. Nobody checks. She didn't fully understand what she was hearing, but she understood the tone. She understood the secrecy. And she understood that these were not the kind of words people say when they're doing something legal. And then she made a mistake. She told someone, not a guard, not a counselor. She told a woman on her block named Tracy, someone she'd been eating with, someone she thought she could trust. Tracy told someone else. And within 48 hours, Sergeant Platt knew that a laundry inmate had been running her mouth about something she overheard in the supply closet. That's when things stopped being ordinary. It was a Tuesday evening just after dinner. Marissa was walking back from the cafeteria alone. The corridor between B block and the laundry wing was long, lit by overhead fluorescents, and empty after 6. She heard footsteps behind her. Not 1 set, 3. She didn't turn around. She walked faster. The footsteps matched her pace. Then a hand closed on her shoulder and spun her. It was Platt. Behind him stood 2 other guards. One held a baton at his side, low and loose, like he wanted her to see it. Platt didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, looked through her. Then he leaned in close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath and said, "You don't listen good, do you?" Marissa tried to speak. She opened her mouth to say she didn't know what he was talking about, but the first blow came before the words did. An open palm across the side of her head, right above her ear. The world tilted. She grabbed the wall. The second guard stepped forward and shoved her chest first into the cinder block. Her head bounced off the surface. She went down, knees first, then palms, then flat on the floor. A boot pressed into the small of her back. Platt crouched beside her. He grabbed her hair and pulled her head up so she was staring at the ceiling, at the dead camera, at the small black dome with no red light. "Nobody hears anything in this building unless I say so. You understand me?" She was crying. Her ear was ringing. Blood from a split on her forehead ran into her left eye. "Say it. I understand." He let go. She dropped. They walked away. 3 sets of boots echoing down the corridor until the sound disappeared. Marissa lay on the floor for what felt like 10 minutes. She pulled herself up using the wall. She limped back to her cell. She didn't go to medical. She didn't report anything. She climbed into her bunk, turned toward the wall, and pressed a wadded-up shirt to the cut on her forehead. 2 days passed. Nothing happened. Platt was on shift. He nodded at Marissa in the cafeteria like they were strangers. The bruise on her cheek was visible to everyone. Nobody asked. That was Whitfield. A woman could walk around with a black eye and the official record would say she slipped in the shower. She tripped on her bunk. She fell. Always fell. The facility hummed along like a machine that had been running too long for anyone to remember what it sounded like when it was off. For a moment, It seemed like the whole thing might just disappear. Like it would become one more story that nobody told and nobody investigated. Marissa went back to laundry. She folded sheets. She kept her eyes on the floor. On the third day after the assault, she sat alone in the cafeteria during lunch and ate a bowl of soup and stared at the wall and did the math in her head. 19 days left. She could survive 19 days. She could keep her head down, serve her time, walk out the front door, and never look back. That's what she told herself. That's what she believed. And for about 48 hours it looked like she might be right. Diane said nothing through all of it. She watched. She wrote in her notebook. She didn't ask Marissa what happened. She didn't need to, because Diane had seen everything. Now here's the thing. Diane Harwell was not just an inmate who kept a journal. She was a former investigative journalist. She'd spent 15 years at a regional newspaper called the Ridgeway Courier, covering the kind of stories that made local officials lose sleep. Municipal corruption, environmental cover-ups, a police department that had been running an illegal traffic stop quota system targeting minority neighborhoods. She was sharp. She was careful. She had a reputation for getting sources to talk when nobody else could, and for never publishing a word she couldn't back up. She won 3 state press awards. One of her stories led to a grand jury investigation. She was, by any honest measure, one of the best reporters in her region. And then she threw it all away with one decision. She fabricated a source for a story about a state senator's financial ties to a land developer. The story itself was true. Every fact in it checked out independently. But the key source, the one she attributed the most damaging quote to, didn't exist. She had invented him to protect a real person who was terrified to go on the record. She thought no one would check. Someone checked. The paper retracted the story. Diane was fired within a week. She was publicly humiliated. Her name became shorthand in journalism circles for the kind of failure that you don't come back from. Eventually, the fallout spiraled into criminal fraud charges tied to the civil suit the senator filed. She pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years. She'd been at Whitfield for 14 months. And in those 14 months, she had done what she always did, what she couldn't stop doing even if she tried. She watched. She listened. She wrote things down in that composition notebook, filling page after page with observations, dates, names, and patterns that nobody else noticed because nobody else was looking. On the night of the assault, Diane had been 30 feet from Marissa, behind a half-open utility door at the end of the corridor. She had a phone, not a regular phone, a microphone, barely the size of a thumb drive, taped inside the spine of her composition notebook. She'd had it smuggled in months ago through a contact she never named. She didn't use it often, maybe once a month, but she used it that night. She hit record. The angle was bad. The light was worse. There was no usable video, but the audio was clear. Every word. Platt's voice. The sound of the impact. Marissa crying. Say it. I understand. Diane sat on her bunk that night, after Marissa had climbed into hers, and she made a decision. She didn't tell Marissa what she had. Not yet. She waited. She needed to move carefully, because Diane understood something that most people don't. Evidence on its own is just information. It doesn't become power until it reaches the right hands. 3 days later, Diane made a phone call. Lights out. The phone from the notebook spine. She dialed a number from memory. It belonged to a woman named Elena Voss, a civil rights attorney based in the state capital, 3 hours south. Elena had built her career on cases that nobody else wanted. Prison abuse, police brutality, wrongful confinement, the kind of work that paid almost nothing and burned you out fast. She'd been doing it for 12 years and she showed no signs of stopping. Diane had met her once, years before, when Elena was building a case against a county jail. They'd spoken for 20 minutes. Diane remembered her because Elena had said something that stuck. The system doesn't break. It works exactly the way it's designed to work. My job is to make that visible. Elena picked up on the second ring. It was past midnight. She didn't sound like she'd been sleeping. Diane spoke fast but clearly. She gave the basics: the facility name, the warden, the guards involved, the assault, the audio recording. Elena asked careful questions. Who was the victim? What was her sentence? How long had she been inside? Diane answered everyone without hesitation. And then she said something that made Elena go quiet on the other end of the line. This isn't just about a woman getting beaten. They're billing for inmates who aren't here. The warden's in on it. The private contractor is in on it. And the girl they beat. She overheard the specifics. That's why they went after her. There was a long pause. Elena had heard stories from inside prisons before. A lot of them. Most turned out to be half-true at best. But something in the way Diane spoke, precise, organized, no wasted words, told her this was different. This woman wasn't guessing. She was reporting. Elena asked one question. Can you get me the recording? Diane said yes. Within a week, the audio was in Elena's hands, routed through 2 intermediaries and a burner email account that Diane deleted the same night she sent it. Within 2 weeks, Elena Voss had filed an emergency petition with the state court. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button, because this is where the story turns. Once that petition hit the court docket, it wasn't just about Marissa Cole anymore. It was about every woman who had ever been inside Whitfield. And the people who had been profiting off their silence were about to learn what happens when the silence stops. Elena's petition didn't just allege assault. It alleged systemic physical abuse and financial fraud at Whitfield County Correctional Facility, facilitated by Warden Carl Brecker and enabled by Stonebridge Corrections. She named Platt. She named the 2 guards. She named Brecker directly, and she attached the audio file under seal. A state inspector arrived at Whitfield within 72 hours. Then a second inspector. Then a forensic accountant. And believe me, what they found was worse than anyone expected. Stonebridge had been billing the state for a higher inmate count than Whitfield actually held. The gap wasn't huge. 15 to 20 phantom inmates at any given time. But the scheme had been running for years. At least 7 by the accountant's estimate. And when you multiply 15 extra beds times the daily rate times 7 years, the number gets very large very fast. The forensic accountant later testified that the total overpayment was in excess of $4 million. The math was simple. More inmates on paper meant more state funding per bed per day. Brecker signed off on the inflated headcounts every month. He personally reviewed the population reports before they were submitted. A mid-level Stonebridge executive named Roland Keyes approved the invoices on the corporate side. Keyes had visited Whitfield exactly twice in 7 years. He didn't need to visit. He just needed the numbers to match. The money flowed up to Stonebridge's general revenue, and a portion of it flowed back down to Brecker, routed through a consulting company called Granite Peak Advisors. Granite Peak had no office, no employees, no website, just a bank account, a routing number, and a P.O. box in a town 40 miles from Whitfield. Over the life of the scheme, Brecker had received just under $600,000 through Granite Peak. Not enough to raise red flags on a tax return if you spread it out, but more than enough to keep a man loyal. When Marissa overheard that conversation in the supply closet, she had stumbled onto the outer edge of a fraud scheme worth millions over its lifetime. And Platt had been Brecker's enforcer for years. Whenever an inmate got curious, filed a grievance, or became a problem in any way, Platt handled it. The disabled cameras weren't a malfunction. They were a feature. Maintenance requests to repair them were filed, logged, and then quietly deleted from the system. It was clean. It was quiet. And it had worked for a very long time. Until a woman with a phone the size of a thumb drive sat behind a utility door and pressed record. The investigation moved fast. Depositions began. Platt hired a defense attorney on the first day. The 2 other guards from the corridor cooperated almost immediately. They gave statements confirming that Brecker had personally ordered the assault. Not in explicit terms. He never said beat her or hurt her. He told Platt, handle the girl in laundry. And everyone at Whitfield knew what handle meant. Elena Voss prepared for trial the way she always did. Methodically, relentlessly. She had the audio recording. She had the cooperating guards. She had the financial records, now subpoenaed and torn open by forensic accountants. And she had Marissa. Marissa, who had never wanted any of this. Who had come to Whitfield for a missed court date and was now the central witness in a federal civil rights case. The trial was held in the county courthouse, a beige building with fluorescent lighting, and a judge named Ruth Alderman. Alderman had a reputation for two things: extraordinary patience and zero tolerance for dishonesty on the stand. Elena built her case in layers. First, the assault. She played the audio in open court. She didn't introduce it with any dramatic statement. She just said, "Your Honor," the recording, and pressed play. The courtroom went quiet. Not performative quiet. Real quiet. The kind where you can hear the ventilation system humming and someone 3 rows back shifting in a wooden seat. Platt's voice filled the room. Flat, unhurried, familiar to anyone who had ever been on the wrong side of someone with power and no accountability. Then the sound of the impact. Then Marissa's voice, shaking, barely above a whisper. "I understand." Several members of the jury looked down at their hands. One woman in the front row closed her eyes and kept them closed until the recording ended. When the audio stopped, Elena let the silence sit for 5 full seconds before she spoke again. Then Marissa took the stand. She was calm, more composed than Elena had expected. She didn't cry. She described the corridor, the footsteps, the hand on her shoulder, the smell of coffee, the boot on her back. She described lying on the floor and staring up at the dead camera and understanding, with absolute clarity, that no one was coming to help her. Then Elena shifted. She moved from the assault to the money. She displayed the financial records on a screen facing the jury. She walked them through the billing discrepancies. She showed the consulting company. She showed the payments flowing to Brecker. She called the forensic accountant, who explained the scheme in language a 12-year-old could follow. And then she called Diane Harwell. Diane took the stand in an orange jumpsuit. She was still incarcerated. She had not been offered a deal. She had not been promised reduced time. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and spoke the way she always spoke. Short sentences. No filler. No emotion she didn't mean. She explained who she was, what she'd done before prison, why she'd been convicted. She hid nothing. She told the jury about the notebook, the phone, the recording. And then she said something that changed the temperature of the room. "I watched Warden Brecker walk that corridor every single day at 4:15 in the afternoon. Every day. He walked past the dead cameras. He looked up at them. And he kept walking. That man didn't just know the cameras were off. He needed them off." The defense attorney objected. Judge Alderman overruled. Elena asked one final question. "In your professional judgment, based on everything you observed inside Whitfield, what were you looking at?" Diane looked at the jury. "A business, not a prison. A business that made money by keeping women locked up and quiet. And when one of those women heard something she wasn't supposed to, the business did what businesses do. It protected itself." The defense tried to shred Diane's credibility. They brought up the fabricated source. They called her a convicted liar. Diane didn't flinch. "I fabricated one source one time. I lost everything because of it. I would not make that mistake again. The audio is real. The records are real. And every woman inside that building who has been hit, silenced, or threatened is real." Then Brecker took the stand. That was his mistake. His attorney had advised against it. But Brecker was the kind of man who believed he could talk his way out of anything because he'd been doing it for 11 years. Elena cross-examined him for nearly 2 hours. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. She started with softball questions. How long had he been warden? What were his responsibilities? How did the reporting structure work? She let him talk. She let him get comfortable. And then she turned. She asked about the cameras. Brecker said they'd been reported as malfunctioning. Routine maintenance backlog, he said. Elena showed him the maintenance logs where the repair requests had been filed and then deleted from the system. Brecker said he didn't know about the deletions. He said maintenance was handled by a different department. Elena showed him his own login credentials on the administrative system that performed the deletions. The timestamp on the most recent deletion was 11 days before the assault on Marissa. The courtroom was very quiet. Brecker drank water. He adjusted his tie. He looked at his attorney, who looked at the table. Then Brecker said, "I don't recall." He said it 14 times over the next 40 minutes. Judge Alderman noted each one. By the end, even the jury had stopped writing. The jury was out for 6 hours. When the bailiff called the courtroom back to order, every seat was full. People who had nothing to do with the case had shown up just to hear the outcome. Word had gotten around. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict, and it landed like a door slamming shut. Platt was found liable on all counts of assault and civil rights violations. The damages were significant. The two cooperating guards received reduced liability in exchange for their testimony. Both were permanently barred from working in any corrections facility in the state. Brecker was found personally liable for conspiracy, civil rights violations, and fraud. The financial judgment against him was substantial. Against Stonebridge Corrections, it was devastating. The state terminated Stonebridge's contract within 30 days. Whitfield was placed under independent oversight by a court-appointed monitor. But here's the thing. The verdict was not the end of the story. It was the hinge, because what came after the trial was quieter and, in some ways, mattered more. Marissa Cole was released 2 weeks after the verdict. Her original 60-day sentence had been served 3 times over by the time the legal process concluded. She walked out of Whitfield on a Thursday morning in October. There were no cameras waiting, no reporters, just Elena Voss, leaning against her car in the parking lot with a manila envelope in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other. The envelope held a check, the settlement amount. Marissa looked at it, put it back in the envelope, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I just want to go home." Elena drove her 3 hours south, through flat country and small towns with grain elevators and shuttered gas stations. They didn't talk much. Marissa leaned her head against the window and watched the road unspool. When they reached Rivorton, Marissa asked to be dropped at her old apartment building. The lease had been broken months ago. Someone else lived there now. She stood on the sidewalk, looked up at the second-floor window that used to be hers, and then got back in the car. They drove to a motel. Marissa slept for 14 hours. Over the following year, the fallout kept spreading. Stonebridge Corrections lost 3 additional state contracts in other facilities. Roland Keyes, the executive who approved the inflated invoices, was indicted on federal fraud charges. Brecker was charged separately by the state attorney general's office. Platt pleaded guilty to avoid a criminal trial and was sentenced to 5 years. The 2 cooperating guards testified again at Keyes' federal trial and walked away free. Diane Harwell served out the remaining 4 months of her sentence. She didn't complain. She didn't give interviews from inside. She kept writing in her composition notebook, just as she had before. When she was released, she didn't go back to journalism. She said the industry wouldn't have her, and she wasn't sure she wanted it back. Instead, she started a small nonprofit that trained incarcerated women to document conditions inside their facilities. Not with phones or cameras, with composition notebooks, careful, accurate, detailed writing, dates, times, names, descriptions of what happened and who was present. She called the organization Clear Record. Within 2 years, it was operating in 11 facilities across 3 states. Diane told an interviewer it was the only skill she had that still meant something. "I can't undo what I did," she said. "But I can teach other women to do what I should have done from the start. Tell the truth. All of it. And write it down where it can't be erased." Marissa used part of her settlement to enroll in a paralegal program at the community college in Riverton. She moved into a new apartment, smaller than the old one, on the other side of town. She got a part-time job at a law office doing filing and reception work. She didn't talk about Whitfield unless someone asked directly, and almost nobody did. She gave one interview to a local reporter. Just one. She said she wanted to understand how the legal system actually worked. Not because she trusted it. Not because she believed it would always do the right thing. But because she had seen firsthand what happened when nobody was paying attention. "I was in that building for 2 months," she said. "And in those 2 months, I learned that the difference between being protected and being hurt is just whether someone is watching. That's it. That's the whole thing." She didn't want to be on the wrong side of that ever again. There's one more thing. About a year after the trial, a handwritten letter arrived at Elena Voss's office. It was on lined paper, postmarked from Whitfield. It was from an inmate named Sandra Gill. Elena had never met her. The letter was short. It said, "I heard about the trial. I heard about Marissa. I want you to know things are different here now. The cameras work. The new guards are different. The food is still bad. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like somebody out there knows we exist." Elena pinned the letter to the wall above her desk. She never took it down. And that's what the story comes down to when you strip away the courtroom and the headlines and the settlement checks. It didn't begin with someone trying to fight the system. It began with an $80 traffic fine and a woman who forgot about a court date. It began with a hand grabbing a fistful of hair in an empty corridor where no cameras were watching. And it ended with a letter from a woman most people will never hear about, saying the simplest and most important thing a person behind a locked door can say. Somebody knows we're here. That's how things change. Not from the top. Not from policy papers or press conferences. From the floor. From the people who were never supposed to have a voice. From the ones who used it anyway.